So here, manifest destiny. Might as well look at the maps here. We can see, so the United States, this is in 1783, this was the United States. Then next one was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 from the French. Florida Purchase was from Spain in 21. Texas was annexed in 45. And then the Oregon Country, the Mexican Secession in 48. And finally the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico in 1853. So by the middle of the 19th century, the United States was the property of the United States. But that doesn't mean that all of it was explored, nor exploited, and that was to follow. Prior to 21, when Florida was purchased from Spain, here are, well, these are the original states, and then the later states of Kentucky. The Kentucky, that's where Daniel Boone became famous. So the pink states, and then the territories are the yellow territories, and then other countries owned all these lands. This was viceroyalty of the New Spain, right here. And this was the Oregon and Washington they were unclaimed territory. And then West Florida, East Florida, all of that belonged to Spain. And there now are the great rivers. The one great river, the Mississippi River, went all the way up there into Minnesota. And then the Missouri River, you see, the Missouri River crossed South Dakota, North Dakota, into Montana, and right into the Washington state. And then the Oregon Trail would then bring one by horse and buggy into Oregon. So these rivers, crossing the Missouri River, one crossed. But even to the east of the Missouri River, there were a great deal of tribes, of Native Americans. And that was the purpose, that to get those territories from them. Here, topography of the United States. So this is the river. The Missouri goes all the way, and then goes through the Rocky Mountains, and you can imagine the landscape was absolutely tremendous. And the Great Basin, Colorado here, plateau. So it was not easy travel. And then, of course, there was a great desire to cut through the mountains, to send the railroads west, and to pursue the opening up of these lands, to go to the Pacific Ocean. Here, the Oregon Trail, as you see here, from St. Louis. St. Louis is on the Mississippi River, and here it's east-west. It's 2,000 plus miles, the Oregon Trail. Large wheeled wagon route that connected the Missouri River to Dalles in Oregon, right here. The eastern part of the Oregon Trail spanned part of the future state of Kansas, that's Daniel Boone, of whom we'll talk soon enough, and nearly all of what are now the states of Nebraska and Wyoming. The western half of the trail spanned most of the future states of Idaho and Oregon. The trail was laid by fur traders, like the ones we had just seen, and traders and other traders from about 1810, 1811 to 1840, over the period of 30 years, and was only passable on foot or by horseback. By 36, when the first migrant wagon train was organized in Independence, Missouri, right there, St. Louis, then Independence, and then from here, a wagon trail had been cleared to Fort Hall, Idaho. But then, so by stages, they were cutting the trail to the west. And then soon enough, also at about the same time, there cut down the Santa Fe Trail. And that trail opened in 21, generally followed old routes established by Native Americans and then used by the Spanish frontiersmen. So those two trails, the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail, became the two major arteries in the exploration of the new land. One of the there was this curious man who was kind of one of the first people on the Santa Fe Trail, a Protestant. And in 21, a revolt in Mexico, again the Spanish rule had succeeded, and Mexico was a free country now and could trade with whomever they pleased. So in Missouri in 21, financial depression gripped the state. The situation was so bad that in Franklin, farmers could not sell their produce. So they had to ship it down to Missouri and Mississippi to New Orleans to get any money. So William Becknell, a 31-year-old salt maker, was in debt and on the verge of going to jail. And what prompted him to plan a desperate trip to Santa Fe is not known, but it saved him from jail, and he also showed the way. And now we come to the next American interest. And the next American interest, of course, were the native populations. And what to do with the native populations? Well, one artist by the name of Charles Bird King, he was just based in Washington, D.C. Essentially, he did not really travel anywhere. So he only painted those people who came to Washington, D.C. to treat with the Americans about the land. And so that's what it says, only saw those who came for negotiations. And what we must understand is that these whites at this point perceived them at best as noble savages. We used the word before, and that's how they looked in the best of light as noble savages. The attitude of the new American populations will change from the noble savage. They then will become incarnation of evil, and then once they wipe them out, then nostalgia will kick in, and there'll be a more rosy image again as for a decimated race. Well, at this point they still see them and they paint them as noble. And when you look at these faces, there's so much dignity in them, and there's so much pride in them, and there's so much strength and self-assurance in these faces. So it's very interesting. So that's the one painter, and he's only interested in the painting, in the faces. He's not, as you see, he's not painting any landscape. Well, but then again, he lives in Washington, and so he's interested in portraying these people as he saw them. But the person who really will be very, very sympathetic to the native populations and will depict them in their milieu will be George Catlin. And there's George Catlin. He in fact will travel either with expeditions or on his own. He was a very courageous man through the American West, and he observed the life of the native populations and painted them. And they were actually fascinated, because while they had, of course, their own art and their own art forms, they did not have the art forms of portraiture. And to see somebody actually catch their likeness was fascinating to a number of them, so they allowed him to paint them. Traveling to American West 5 times during the 30s, he was the first white man to depict plain Indians in their native territory, claiming his interest in Americas, and he knew it was a vanishing race. He just as Thomas Cole knew that the American landscape was disappearing, and Catlin knew that it was a vanishing race. It was sparked by, he was kind of an average painter, and he's self-taught again. He was in Philadelphia, and he caught the sight of a delegation of Native Americans, and that interested him tremendously, and he decided actually to devote his life and to go and find out how they live and what their culture is. And he was really the first white man who wished to understand So, following a brief career as an attorney, he produced 2 major collections of paintings of American native populations and published a series of books chronicling his travels. In the end, he wished to sell his collection to the Congress, but the Congress had zero interest. They felt it was too much money to pay, and ultimately he actually took them to Europe, and in London, of course, they raised great interest, but nobody wants to pay. And I mean, it was something like, these are the only pieces that actually tell us of the life of the native tribes. This is the record between him and someone else, a Swiss painter. Here, for instance, the war consul, I mean, actually with Caitlin, because he was self-taught, he will not convey he painted sort of more general impressions, more sketchy impressions that the other painter will actually paint.
So this is it from the Western.
This is it
from the Western perspective. Because
this is it.
Anything else we have is from the actual descendants of
from
tribes.
descendants, right?
So this is kind of lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, yeah. He managed to sell it to a private individual for whatever 1/10 of the original price, and then it did. Now, of course, it's in a museum in Washington.
Oh, it must be priceless now.
Yeah, exactly. Here, for instance, he shows the buffalo hunt. You see how people put the skins of wolves on themselves to approach the buffaloes. Yeah, yeah. And this is also the hunting of the buffalo. I love this one. The Crow Chief. I mean, talk of painting a centaur. This is a force of nature. This is sort of like the Niagara Falls.
So he reminds me of Napoleon on his horse crossing the Alps.
Of course.
Oh, you raised me right.
I know, right? It's the same tradition. Same tradition in a very different culture. But this, and it's interesting because his crown and the crown on the horse is very similar. And it's like they manifest nature, the power of nature, the purity of nature, the force of nature, all of it is in it. And I mean, talk of a heroic diagonal that was first introduced by the ancient Greeks. Well, even the gladiator in the Borghese, that's a heroic diagonal as well. This also is a heroic diagonal. He drops the horizon line very, very low.
Yeah, so that he's above it all.
Yes, he's the emperor. It's a brilliant painting.
These are watercolors?
These are watercolors.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And this one, here it says in 37, he began to show, this also, I love this. I mean,
they look like Pompeian frescoes. Yes,
but the force, the way, it is watercolors, but how he conveys this force. It's the wind. He's conveying the wind. Here at 37, he began to show his Indian gallery, he called it, to viewers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. By then, it comprised nearly 500 paintings, along with thousands of sketches and artifacts. By 1840, he visited 48 tribes. Alexis de Tocqueville, who traveled in America at the same time, he once said the consciousness of swift and inevitable change must have weighed heavily on his mind. I know.
Oh, yeah.
I know, it's horrible, right? He knew that his subject was dying, not just slipping away, but ground to extinction by his, George Caitlin's, own people.
It reminds me, looking at these paintings kind of reminds me of looking at Holocaust footage.
Yes.
Before the people knew what was about to happen to them.
Well, it was Holocaust.
Or as they kind of were beginning to realize what was about to happen to them. It kind of has the same effect.
I mean, there was this proud race of people who just happened not to share in the culture of the newcomers.
Right.
And also didn't have their weaponry. He spoke of forming, he was behind the whole idea of a national park. National park containing man and beast in all the wild and freshness of their nature's beauty. Just don't touch them. Let them live their own lives as they like to live them. It would preserve the Native Americans by exempting them from history. the tidal wave of white settlement would flow past them, leaving them in peace. He invented the idea of a national park, but too early for the whites and too late for the Indians. Yeah. Karl Bodmer is the name of the German, Swiss German, Swiss French. I thought he was German. Printmaker, engraver, draftsman, painter. Now he was a very well trained painter. He could depict likeness, and he also was very much trained in formal art, illustrator and hunter. He accompanied the German explorer, not Humboldt, but another one, Prince Maximilian, for 2 years through on his Missouri River expedition. And so he also left a record, including many tribes on the Missouri River. He had 81 aquatints made from his work to illustrate Prince Maximilian's book of travels in North America. And here he paints the sculpt dance. I mean, of one of the, and here are the sculpts. I mean, all of these people will soon enough be. So you see one of the chiefs, and in this case, everything means something. The weapon, the claws on his neck, the painting, it all means something. That with whom he fought and what he won, which victories he won, everything. Here is one of the Dog Society of the Native Americans, but these are very, very incredibly cohesive sketches. The magic pile of another tribe with the bullock skull on it. And this one is pretty amazing. I mean, every single bear claw is described, and he's wearing this extraordinary buffalo and painted red buffalo hide. I think the wolf's tail also here there's one and here's another, means that he defeated 2 enemies in face-to-face battle, and the eagle's feathers fence also means something here. Since Lewis and Clark's expedition, and they, for some reason, they didn't take any Lewis and Clark. They went west. They didn't take any painters with them, which is kind of strange. Through regular contacts, since that expedition and through regular contacts with traders and trappers, germs of smallpox were introduced, and in 1837 it just devastated the tribes. In addition, there we go. And in addition, President Andrew Jackson, a notorious Indian killer, who habitually referred to them as savage bloodhounds, called for a policy of apartheid. And he was the populist who of course, presented his policy as something very beneficial to the native tribes. The terrible years of Indian Removal Act, which is what was called, proved an unmitigated disaster for Cherokees, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and others. Fenimore Cooper, I think, wrote The Last of the Mohicans. He wrote The Chief of the Seminoles, because I read all that stuff when I was growing up. The Chief of the Seminoles and The Last of the Mohicans. Those were great books. Some 70,000, 7-0, were harried from their lands east of the Mississippi. Of the Cherokees alone, 4,000 died on the Trail of Tears from Tennessee to Oklahoma. Right. But then, when the native tribes resisted this policy, then they were looked upon as savages. So never mind, no longer noble savages, but just as Andrew Jackson called them, savage bloodhounds. And there were painters, of course, that were ready to oblige. And there's actually one by John Vangeline, and the death of Jane McCree. We don't really know the circumstances, but it seems that she was a young woman who was supposedly killed by a native warrior associated with the British Army, in fact, because the British Army engaged the native tribes in their ranks. So we don't know who killed her. Affianced to a loyalist serving in his army, her slaying led to expressions of outrage and an increase in patriot military recruiting, especially in the days following her killing. Well, John Vanderlyn, who was trained as an academic painter at this point, when he obviously wasn't at the event, so he mentions the whole thing, and he represents it as he takes the girl herself, the composition and her attitude from the ancient representations of Niobe, who was a Greek woman who boasted that she has so many children. Did she boast essentially?
It's the mother of Apollo and Artemis.
And so this mother sent her two children and eliminated all the children of Niobe. And this is the attitude in which Niobe usually was portrayed in the ancient world. So that's the attitude that Vanderlyn just essentially borrowed, appropriated for her figure. And the two, they are taken directly from Greek and Roman representations also, and they're represented as Native Americans. And then there was another one. There's this the Osage scalp dance, and he represents them again as savage tribe who have taken possession of a woman and her little child. And then, of course, all sorts of horrors could be imagined as to what would happen to the woman. She's wearing this very gauzy shift, which of course a woman would not wear on an Oregon Trail, for instance, or any other trail. But she's represented as vulnerable as possible, and of course the little child next to her with his bottom naked, again the innocence, a very, very vulnerable innocence. And then the one here, the one next to her, is raising his tomahawk to crush their skulls, whereas another, who presumably is the chief of the tribe, stops him with his lance. But he's wearing on his chest, he's wearing a medal that was given by the Congress at that time to the native chiefs who distinguished themselves in one way or another. So here we're supposed to understand that. So he was familiar with the white population and therefore acquired some mercy. So these are the sort of paintings that occurred in the process. There's the strange men. Charles Dees, I mean he'll end up in the asylum and he'll die there, and there he represents somebody like Daniel Boone, the explorer, who is attacked by a Native American, and this is this struggle to the dead, and the Native American is looking savagely, and the explorer is doing his best, but then both horses look like devil incarnate, and then both of them are falling off the ridge and into the abyss. And so looks like a madman, and he was, in fact. But interestingly enough, there are all sorts of these little representations, these little sculptures that are made of this image, as you see, sort of the kitsch expression of that same image. And until today, in the Capitol in Washington, the Enrico Cosici represented Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone had his own hagiography at that time, fighting a representative of Native Americans with this blood-curdling grin on his face, who's fighting the noble Daniel Boone here. Cosici was for 4 years, he was engaged in developing reliefs in the Capitol, and one of these shows the legendary pioneer Daniel Boone in a life and death struggle. And there's another, a smaller one, and he had to be smaller because of the shape of the doorway, in fact, who is already done in by our pioneer. And here it is. There's the Capitol. You see, there's the Capitol building, and you see these narrow. I think ours is right here. It's above the doorway. And here it is. This is how it looks. It seems that some representatives of the native tribes came at the time when Constitution was doing it, and they were shown the relief, and they just ran out of the room in horror, which was which was interpreted, of course, as they realized the superiority of the white race.
Oh my God!
Right, pretty bad. And now you see the mood switched again, because now that the race was exterminated, there comes the nostalgia and melancholy. And so this is the last of the race. The white race came to the Pacific, and they pushed. So this is the last of the family. They're gazing across this immense space of water, knowing that they have nowhere, they don't have anywhere to go any longer. This is all that's left for them. This rock, and the father is staring out with great dignity. Dignity is now returned to them again, and the dog is the one who understands what is. The dog understands what is happening. You can almost hear him. And in this case, you see the clouds. Their life is not the blue skies, but the clouds are rising, predicting their existence. The great deal of romance and melancholy now that they have been exterminated. Our Albert Bierstadt, who will be the representative of Manifest Destiny in painting, will then paint the last of the buffalo, but will paint the native population as if they were the ones who destroyed the buffalo, not the white population shooting at them from the railroad, from the railroad cars. There's this immense space of the West with the Native American destroying one of the last buffaloes, and there's some others who are riding behind him, and the poor, and there's the buffalo who are running, who are trying to escape. Interestingly enough, however, you see, by this time we are about 1890, and suddenly now American painters, American intellectuals in New York and Philadelphia, and those who are with the times, are beginning to understand that again they have fallen behind Europe. And there are all sorts of things that are happening in Europe that are much more modern and much more with the times, while the Americans are still lagging behind with their landscapes and with their manifest destiny. So interestingly enough, though, this is the year of the Great Paris exhibition, which celebrates the centenary since the Paris Revolution, since French Revolution in 1789. And there were a number of paintings that were chosen to send to this exhibit. Bierstadt was not among them, even though before that he was the glory of American painting. And so he painted the last of the buffalo and submitted to organizing committee the Paris Universal Exposition, and was rejected. But someone, in fact, objected, and that's what he wrote, the following extract from New York World. He's referring now to the organizing committee, who feel now themselves empowered. What manner of pygmies of pigment are these alleged artists who are seeking a notoriety beyond the reach of their daubs by forming committees from their petty little selves, and then giving wide publication to the fact that they have rejected one of Albert Bierstadt's pictures, ... The only excuse for this amassing impudence furnished by the so-called artists in charge was that Mr. Bierstadt did not belong to their school of art. This is a thin excuse given by the so-called learned committee of chromo tinkers who selected their own nightmares for the Paris exhibition, insulted Mr. Enos, he is another of the beautiful luminist painters, and rejected Mr. Bierstadt's magnificent work, The Last of the Buffalo. Now, back to Daniel Boone. He was a curious character. He was a land speculator who was once, in fact, captured by Native Americans, and he escaped, and that gave him great panache. He also dealt in purchasing lands, very often cheating them out of it, and then he wrote a book. Well, actually, he dictated a book of his life, and exaggerating it, of course, completely out of proportion, and then settled himself once in a cabin on a lake, and he's connected with Kentucky, and there he had hundreds of copies of this book, and the trail led to the cabin, and he would sit there and sell the book for $1, kind of wink at the purchasers and say, well, you know, every single word is true, and he'd sit there, of course, in his buckskins and his hat. So Thomas Cole actually imagined, he did a painting of him at the lake, and he looks like half madman, half a river god in this painting, as always, of course, with Thomas Cole insertion of metaphysics into the painting. So he made quite a bit of money, Daniel Boone, on this thing. Whether or not he fought hand to hand, that remains very questionable. Our George Kelly Bingham actually painted him, you see, as this great pioneer. I like his portraits a lot better. It also becomes sort of a religious painting. On the one hand, the Moses leading the people out of Egypt into the Promised Land, and on the other hand, he becomes the Moses, and on the other hand, escape into Egypt of Joseph and Mary, and there's Mary sitting on a horse, and Daniel Boone now becomes the Joseph who protects her. So they move towards us now through the mountains towards the Pacific Ocean, and we saw the same thing with the Puritans in New England originally. A German painter was commissioned by the government, interestingly, also at the very beginning of the Civil War, to actually paint this manifest destiny. It is 20 feet by 30 feet. It is in the U.S. Capitol, the western staircase of the House of the Representatives chamber. It is enormous, and it's kind of divided into parts, and the left part is, that's it, they reached the Pacific Ocean. They're looking at it. And so the loss that we had just seen is standing on that one rock that's left to him. There's an American flag, of course, being raised. Someone looking like Daniel Boone is showing a mother and a child, or two submissive women, how great the process was. In the back are the carts with the bones of the buffalo, and the bones of the horses, and the bones of all those who tried to do it and couldn't succeed. And then at the bottom you see this ineffable scene of the Pacific Ocean. Is it kitsch? Yeah. Yes. He actually also painted the Washington crossing the Delaware. Of course, the where he crossed the Delaware is actually well, we will live right next to it. It's not very wide, and it's not very deep either. And there aren't all that, the ice on the Delaware doesn't form so often. And not to mention if there's so many people in the boat would capsize. And of course the Washington could never stand. But it makes for a very propagandistic and a very popular picture. Now, talk of Bierstadt, that's the man of the Last Buffalo. He was a tremendous painter. He was German. He did receive good training in painting, and none of these landscapes are the actual landscapes. He came to America, he realized how full of tremendous landscapes, and this is where his talent could find its inspiration, and indeed that's exactly happened. This is the whole thing is the manifest destiny, based on sketches made during his travels with the survey party in '59. Painting shows Landers Peak in the wide river range of the Rocky Mountains, with an encampment of Native Americans right here in the foreground. It has been compared to and exhibited with The Heart of the Andes by Frederick Church, and you see why. It is a tremendous, just stupendous landscape of God's creation, and the encampment of the Native Americans, well, will soon disappear. Here's another one, and he actually met a group of German settlers as in their way west, and sort of fell in with them. I mean, he was also German, and then he figured he would represent the immigrants as they're crossing the plain towards the setting sun, because they're going to the west, so it's towards the west, the setting sun, but everything is in peace and prosperity, and of course the composition is brilliant. You have rocks on the one side, trees on the other, and diagonally sort of going into the painting and towards the sun, towards the promised land, goes the caravan. This one, in fact, was, I mean, a lot of these paintings were now being commissioned by great American industrialists who wanted to see a portrait of what they were doing now. And he was getting tremendous amount of money for them, sort of on par with about I don't know, a couple of $1 million per canvas. And this one, in fact, shows the railroad. It shows the train going through the mountains, goes to the west, and this was a tremendously difficult part of railroad building where very many people died, and there was in fact there was one story when the party was caught in a winter storm, and I mean slowly died, but instances of cannibalism and this always of course happened. But now the commissioner of the painting hung it in his mansion, and it showed that now it's completely safe, and nature is not disturbed, and one in fact can relax in a very luxurious palm couch on his or her way west. The one painter that I did not mention before but should probably be mentioned is John James Audubon, who was also self-taught. He was also a hunter, and he loved birds, and that's what he loved. It so happened that there were no cameras at the time, so in order for a bird to be depicted, one had to shoot a bird, and that's what he did. He would shoot these. I mean, there were plenty of birds in America. I mean, there were no. It was the native populations, human populations, that were being exterminated, not the bird populations. So he would shoot one and then arrange it in a certain way, and then paint it as if in its natural environment, and did a tremendous job. I mean, no one did better than he. He apparently was not a pleasant man. He tried to sell these huge pieces in America failed, took them to England, and there he found purchasers and made quite a bit of money and became quite successful. Here he paints the golden eagle with a little rabbit, big rabbit, in his talons, and one of the talons very literally pierces the rabbit's eye, and you can see a bit of blood coming out. But it's described beautifully, everything about the bird. It's watercolor pastel here, it tells you how it's done. Here's still another one, and the swallowtail kite, again arranged with a snake in its talons, and the snake sort of very serpentine, as if in the last moments of its life. And again, the bird is described very, very beautifully. As I said, he went to England, and there he was quite successful. With Bierstadt, as we saw in 1889, he was making $2 million a painting in our money today, at the time in the 1870s. But then by 1890, the presumptive heirs, the new artists, the presumptive heirs to the modern art of Europe, rejected, in fact, one of his paintings to be sent to the Paris exhibition, because by now America was entering the new stage. It was tired of landscapes now. They had enough landscapes, they were going elsewhere. They were turning their faces back to Europe and back to the experiment. And that's what we'll be talking about in our next lecture. Goodbye, and have a good day.